Zoom call, which will automatically record too. Okay, it's all set. Started.
Cool, perfect. Hey, community, there was one area where I wanted to spend time, which was on the product use cases for Nephio V1. So, what we've done until now, just to summarize for everyone's benefit, we have shared the design goals and principles as of almost 4 weeks ago. That was just a synthesis of what we have historically defined when the community was getting formed, but somewhat tailored those to for the guidance of the community. And then there was a requirements document that Sana had circulated to the community to get the feedback about what, especially telcos, but generally from the community, what we all believe are the key requirements. So we have taken, collated those requirements. Sana and I also worked offline on those. High level, Sana, please keep me honest here. The way we projected out going through each requirements offline based on the community discussion in the last SIG meeting, it looked like there was a common theme across these requirements, and it fairly well aligned with the user stories and the product scope that Google had positioned about, I forget, 6 weeks ago or so, the user stories document. So what I did was I went about and cleaned up the document, somewhat borrowing from some of the verbiage and details in the requirements document. And my goal is to then now present it to the community and help drive alignment, discussing some of the open questions. But before I go deeper, Sana, do you have anything else to add?
Kaushik, I think you summarized it very well. The common theme across all the requirement specs were exactly similar to what Google had envisioned in the beginning, and that seems to be the short-term uh, requirements that we can accomplish. And I have reviewed the document. You can go ahead and get into the discussion of the document.
Perfect. Uh, can everyone see the doc?
Yes, it started now. Yes.
Perfect. So the related material, like I described, the design principles and the requirements feedback, they are listed at the top. By the way, I hope without having the documentation framework through LF, we're still using Google Docs. I see many of you did not have access. I've tried to grant access as the request came in. If anyone does not have access, please ping me offline. I'm happy to grant, but my hope is most of you, if not all, have access to the doc and have seen this a priori. But regardless, again, just to summarize quickly, product goals: build automation for network functions with respect to both baseline NF deployment and NF configuration. But one of the key things, especially looking at V1, we want to make sure the scope of automation for Nephio should ensure that the network function is fully functional and operational. So what we don't want is taking bits and pieces of configuration and trying to structure Nephio around it. Rather, we want to make sure the network function is fully operational per its published capabilities. Uh, there was a question follow up about day one versus day two. So let's probably I'll come to that when in a bit. The second product scope aspect is build automation to showcase NF to infrastructure dependency management. This is something that is critical because these are both interrelated resources or sets of resources. Third was both operators and operators of operators. The framework around it and the interworking of the operators should be established in the community with very clear documentation tied to that. And the documentation will potentially involve, custom resources and so forth, so that operators, there is a very clear way for operators to interplay with each other. And the last is the key themes, which is CRDs, the structure, the schemas, and how do you delineate the common parts of CRD from the vendor-specific portions of the custom resources, which should be established in the community. Our position is free 5GC should be the means to achieve these product goals uh, with very clear documentation established from the community. Any questions so far? Okay. Again, we had discussed some. Sorry,
Kaushik,
go ahead.
just to understand that. So your first goal. First of all, thanks for putting this together. Very nice. So your intent is to, given a network function for the Nephio V1 release timeframe, you want to achieve the automation of deployment and configuration of that in its completeness, right? When you said we do not want to automate parts of configuration, we want to make sure that all the configuration that is needed to make the network function functional has to be done by V1. That's the goal, right? Just want to make sure that my understanding is correct.
Correct, Bala. And I'll just maybe add a little bit of caveat to that. When I say fully functional, it's not necessary our goal to validate each functional capability of a network function. But by and large, what we want to make sure is we don't take bits and pieces of the network configuration and say we have, activated that or automated the deployment of that configuration with to the network function. So what we need to make sure is we have reviewed the full set of configuration as applicable to a network function and ensured the Nephio automation constructs are applied to that full suite of config.
Thank you so much. My second question would be that you said obviously the free 5GC is what is a way to go for us. So are you envisioning everything in free 5GC to be part of P1 or a particular function such as UPF or SMS or SMF? Is there any specific thing that we are targeting?
So if you don't mind, Bala, hold on to your thought.
Okay,
The subsequent user stories will give you that detail.
That's fine. Thank you. Thank you, Kaushik.
Anyone else on the scope or the product goals for Nephio event before we go to the user stories?
I believe David had a comment regarding multi-vendor support.
Yeah,
I did, and I think that speaks to the, is it a goal to have like a common CRD where instances are managed by different controllers somehow? Is that a goal here or not?
So I would say there will be, in my opinion, there would be a goal to define CRDs that are common and can be consumed by different vendor controllers. They won't necessarily be the sum total of all the CRDs that those controllers need to achieve their goals. But yes, effectively something like duck typing or defining common interfaces that everybody can read from or process would be a goal. Yes, now they're not going to be perfect, but as a start.
I think that's always been a goal since we launched Nephio.
And that includes those. Okay, and that includes 2 vendors deployed in the same cluster.
It's possible. Yeah,
it's possible. Yeah.
It's possible.
I mean,
it's everything's possible.
So they wouldn't be. It wouldn't be. This is a kind of a big discussion, but if you think about the difference between Ingress API and Gateway API, so in Ingress API, what you have is effectively an abstraction that people create, and then they tag it and say this controller should process that abstraction, and that led to some problems with respect to extensibility. And so that if you look at Gateway API, that's an evolution of based on learning from Ingress API. So we want to model something more like Gateway API. Which means we take the vendor pieces and we kind of hide them or externalize them in a class structure, as well as potentially in associated CRDs. To me, this is I've said this over and over, and I hope it's not too abstract, because maybe without concrete examples, it's hard to understand it, but I don't want the abstraction in control. I want the independent controllers consuming common understood pieces of abstraction instead of the other way around. But concretely, look at the deltas between an Ingress API in Kubernetes and a Gateway API in Kubernetes, and you'll see some of the evolution we want to learn from.
Okay, so I guess my hand is next. So more to David's question that is more relevant for SIG1, is that a use case? I think that's the question. If I have a UPF that wants to deploy on a target cluster, is it possible that any of the users in meeting right now, is it Is it something that is common that I want to deploy 2 different vendors UPFs on the same target cluster? Maybe a user, say Eric.
No, not really today.
Okay.
No, today I think the way we deploy UPF, it's only from one vendor in one kind of cluster. That's all.
Thank you. Sorry, Ravi, go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, I think you are touching on the. I think comments came on vendor network functions and so on. And with free 5GC, I think what you're doing is primarily achieving some kind of functional objective, nothing performance oriented. So I mean, do we want to say that explicitly in V1, or because when you bring in vendors, and you have to deal with several other things, right? And their own operators or their own EMS systems, and then cache requirements, core pinning, and SRIV, and all the things that comes from it, right? So I mean, somewhere I think we should make that clear exactly, the automation machinery, of course, but then from a network function validation of the 3GPP interfaces, from a functional or a performance perspective, I think we should make that objective clear.
Sure. I mean, the hope obviously is that all those things are factored into some sort of deployment descriptions, well, meaning Kubernetes deployment descriptions, and then we can deploy them blindly. But then they would also be creating requirements around those if they need to do some sort of compliance by spinning up the EMS or something, then they should that hopefully that's something that we could describe. But then vendor also could extend what they can process. But then for sure, spinning up an operators that can process our common CLDs is the job of Nephio.
Yeah, no, my question is that within the scope of V1? So that was my question, to kind of validate vendor CNS, or
we'll definitely have to work with vendors to see whether or not that's possible. Well, I mean, that's definitely a stretch goal. But yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well,
I think Eric is next, or sorry, are you so go ahead.
No, I was saying if vendor CNF is in the picture, then I think we should start capturing those requirements as well, because that will be a long list compared to what free 5GC.
Yeah, I mean, we do want vendors to contribute to requirements also. So on the doc user stories. So definitely, we should take that into account. Eric.
Thanks.
Okay, sorry. Thanks.
Yes, it was just because we have some global requirement about vendors here, but in the user story, I'm not sure to find some let's say dedicated user story for vendors typically. We explain that here in the global requirement we need to define some CRD structure schema and also for vendor, but in the various user story defined just after, I don't find a user story dedicated to the vendor to help them to write the CRD and so on.
Okay, that's probably a question, probably more a question for Kaushik.
Hey folks, maybe just stepping back a little bit, right? First of all, one, this is more of a product requirements and user stories document. This is not yet a technical requirement specification. We'll need to get to that, right? So with that caveat, the way I would say this is, I know some of you had brought up about multi-vendor support and how do you delineate between the common parts and the vendor parts. The last bullet of this does outline that's a key requirement or goal of Nephio V1. But from the standpoint of, do we need to bring in a vendor NF and then incubate that as part of the Nephio V1? I don't think that has to be a strict requirement. Of course, if we can make it happen with some of you out there, that's great. I'm extremely happy to make it happen. The way we are positioning this is with free 5GC, we should be able to still prove or create this logical framework. If vendors can plug in with their implementation within Nephio V1 timelines, that's fantastic. But I don't want to necessarily make that as a strict requirement.
No, I don't think this is the requirement. I just want to say we need, let's say, to provide some tools to help vendors at the end of the day. But we don't need to have, let's say, vendor solution available at V1. But at least we must start the journey to provide some tools based on what we are doing for free 5GC that can be useful for vendors to help them to write their dedicated operator and so on. I think it's just a matter of explaining what we are achieving, but
I want to jump in and make one comment to a lot of questions that were asked here, and to some extent, Eric, to your question as well. When I was gathering the requirements, I felt there is a common theme across every service provider trying to work on the 5G core, that there is a lot of heterogeneity across different network functions on a lot of levels that we can't solve at once with targeting of requirements to V1 or maybe even in the future. What Kaushik has tried to propose in this initial V1 through the requirements captured in the document is to show the first example in how a configuration or CRD or the operators can actually accomplish one or a couple of network functions, which may or may not be a solution to all other network functions right away, because we understand a very big heterogeneity exists between vendor to vendor. The CNI plugins are different, the configuration schemas are different, the deployment is slightly different. They have so much different that we can't solve all of their requirements in one iteration. But what will happen through looking at this work on the release one on the free 5GC is that we'll find a functioning working example. And then a lot of service providers who are actually a part of this community can actually go back and work with our vendors and bring those vendors to the table. How can we use the same models to use on your 5G core networks? That would be an evolutionary exercise that has to happen across the industry. And back to your point, Ravi, the requirements around EMSs, the VNF managers, a lot of that is actually falling apart with when I look at the power of Kubernetes and how this can be accomplished. So this is going to challenge the existing status quo. It's not going to fit into the existing harmony as in very smoothly. But if we like it, if this makes sense, then this evolutionary exercise has to happen through all of us. And it would be a lot of iterations eventually when this transition happens. So I'm also extremely impatient to see a little bit of uniformity across how we are accomplishing that for the other vendors, which are actually on-prem on greenfield deployments pipeline on our radar right now. But we need to actually watch and see how can we make this work for the other vendors eventually. And how will those vendors actually come to the table and work with us? And some are already in the community, so we have a little bit of support from them at the moment. I'll give it back to you, Kaushik, so you can go back to your document once the question's finished.
Yeah, Wim has a hands up.
Yeah, so I just wanted to chime in as a vendor. I think, I think you said the same, Shanna, is basically, I think the first, or at least that's how I look at it, I think our first goal should be the decomposition. I think one of the common themes is like the decoupling of the network function and infra, which I think is something that we have to achieve, and the decomposition to set a standard on how we would deploy these network functions, right? I think the mapping of multi-vendor, I think I would see a secondary goal here, because I think initially, given what we have on our plate, the decomposition will be a lot of work, right? So if we do that right, plugging in multi-vendor should be fairly easy to do. So I would focus on version 1 being the automation and making that simple and having that decomposition between network function, infra, and stuff like that. And then if we do that right, because just to be clear, I think free 5GC is a good reference implementation, but it's not representative of the real life yet. So as such, there will be lots of things that we need to add on top. But if the foundation is right, building on top would be fairly straightforward. So the way I look at it is for V1 is to focus on that decomposition and do that right. But in the back of our mind, we want to include, of course, multi-vendor into that. Does that make sense?
Yes, that's the goal, Wim.
Yeah. Okay.
Bernard?
And Bernard has a question.
Yeah, just to add on that, what Wim has just mentioned, I believe that if we're talking about decomposition, we will again have to talk about dependency management. And my sort of concern simply here is that if we're not starting to categorize what kind of dependencies we are wanting to address, then sort of could be that we are building snowflake architectures and snowflake sort of orchestration approaches, which are difficult to translate into for other network functions. So if we're talking about sort of decomposition, I would love to have some kind of common notion of what are the rules, what are the dependencies to be accounted for, and then I would agree that sort of this would help us also support a multi-vendor type of scenario.
Bernard, right. That's the goal. I think we should allow Kaushik to go through the rest of the document, and I have a feeling that once we go through the user stories, we'll get a little bit of understanding on what is the focus of V1. As you remember, we captured a lot of requirements in our short-term and long-term stories, but what can be captured in the V1 release is something that can be accomplished in a short period of time. So we'll let Kaushik go through the rest of the document and then see if some of our questions are answered. Kaushik, over to you.
Oh, perfect. Thank you, Sana. By the way, my input was on the side channel was just it was on a lighter vein. I did not mean to stop the comments. I really appreciate and value all the feedback coming from all of you. Yes, we all need to stay focused and figure out what the Nephio V1 structure is, right? So with that, I'll step right into user story 1. But just a little bit of background. I think we discussed this as well last time. The reason we have proposed free 5GC is not because it's the greatest, but it's readily available. We can stitch together a bunch of network functions that showcases the product goals, and there are no regulatory barriers or other barriers to adopt in an open source community. It's the quickest way to get off the ground. Maybe there are other choices. I know some of you had talked about mocks and other things. I'm open to suggestions. We can sort it out if there is something reasonable that we can quickly and speedily push for from an implementation. So with that caveat, user story 1, this is take a set of network functions, a small set of network functions, and stitch them together through Nephio automation. So, and the goal is to complete, let's say, a basic 5G attached procedure in the most minimal way. The work scope here, the way we are proposing is free 5GC, AMF, SMF, UPF. Again, the implementation choices are separate from this document, whether we do cups. I know I need to clean this up, but we are not strongly encouraging or pushing for cups. Maybe that's the more logical choice, but it's up to the architecture of choice that we all converge towards. But from this product document, it's more about these are the 3 NFs. Well, we have chosen these NFs because these are the minimal set that allows us to establish the baseline functionality of a 5G attach. Automating the setup of the, sorry, maybe this part is about, not necessarily correct, but work scope here is NFs and the transport between various clusters, edge and as needed, centralized clusters, and 3GPP interface are the ones that I've described. What is not in scope, or maybe I'll come back to that in a bit. With the proposed design, you can see a representative figure. Again, this is not the only way to accomplish. This is the design is not within the scope of this document, but this showcases you have got 2 edge clusters running UPF and SMF, and a centralized cluster running AMF. But again, it's up to all of us to figure out what's the right way to instantiate this. This document makes no premise about the type of edge cloud and this public cloud in which these need to be instantiated. As Google, we have done some groundwork on GDC and GKA respectively, which are our homegrown edge cloud and public cloud implementations. But we all encourage the community to go contribute, right? So I don't want to diverge too much into the design considerations. And like I said, this is more of a representation. But what this accomplishes is a baseline set of Nephio-driven automation that allows a full capability of these 3 NFs that allows us to establish a baseline 5G attach call. What is not in scope? orchestration cluster and various clusters, workload clusters here that are shown here, automation of those. We expect Nephio V1 to ensure or rather to have a manual process for cluster creation for the various clusters involved. Any NFs that are not specified here are out of scope. So if you want to, let's say, have a test bed to validate 5G attached, whatever you need for a UE RAN and so forth, that's outside the scope of Nephio. And automating the setup of transport, including necessary security as needed, that should be done out of band from Nephio. Any questions so far on user story 1? I know I'm rushing a little bit, just trying to finish everything, but any questions on story 1?
I'll just quickly state that we do have community members, Sandeep from Arna in particular, who's interested in the workload cluster setup. So that may be a stretch goal, but we can leave it out as a direct requirement for now. So that's workload cluster creation.
That's a fair point. And maybe that generally applies broadly to anything that is listed as out of scope. It's not to say if anyone in the community has both the cycles and the mechanics to figure out how to help drive it, yes, we are extremely happy. By default, it's not a strict requirement, and we'll need to figure out based on where the community is in helping shape the scope over time.
But let me try to understand, what is the proof point which we are showing here? Sort of what is shown here which you cannot do with Helm charts? Are we sort of trying to address infrastructure related aspects regarding tunneling protocols, etc.? Sort of what would be the special part where we say this is how Nephio solves the following problem?
Bernard, this is John. Sorry, you had a.
Oh, I was just go ahead. I was going to respond. I mean, the difference is going to come in at day 2 primarily, and because we're keeping a model that's consistently sort of processable, will enable day 2 things that are extremely difficult to do with Helm charts. I mean, ultimately, it's all about the management of the configurations and how complex and difficult that is to do. And we believe the methodology we're using will make it a lot cleaner and more automatable.
Okay.
So Kaushik, I had one observation, one. So I know you have a lot of.
Before Bala, just one input to Bernard that I wanted to say. Bernard, there are a set of design principles and guidelines. The goal is Nephio, all of this work scope for Nephio V1 or even in the future, we all have to apply those design principles and design goals to ensure we can showcase the true value of Nephio. So this is not just to say we can automate a UPF, which today you can do through Helm charts and so forth. So what's the big deal, right? But there is a reason why Nephio has been established as a Linux Foundation project with a key set of product and design principles, and the goal is to ensure the implementation follows those details very closely. And through that is what we believe we'll be able to demonstrate the true differentiating value of Nephio.
Kaushik, I want one more clarity, and now I'm derailing your meeting more. But I just wanted to be more clear on the out of scope part where you're saying automating the orchestration cluster creation using Nephio. So this includes just the creation of the cluster itself from its basic composition, or does that include interaction with our CNI plugins and the configuration of CNI plugins as well?
So when you go to the next user story, Sana, I can
Okay.
about the CNI plugins, but we believe that by default, not all CNI plugin automation should be in Nephio V1 scope. We'll need to be a little bit picky about if there are certain set of CNIs that we can easily automate and so forth. That should be straightforward, but you may not be able to get to the full universe. The orchestration cluster, by the way, is not depicted here in this diagram. This is only showcasing the three workload clusters, 2 on the edge and 1 in the centralized cluster. But there will be a orchestration cluster where all the management plane functions are running, and that cluster creation is proposed to be manual in Nephio V1.
Okay, Kaushik, I'll let you go through the rest of the stories.
Yeah, that's what I was going to propose, Kaushik. I think probably, I I think in the interest of time and other aspects as well, because some of the questions you may be covering in the next user stories, I was gonna suggest that Kaushik go through all the user stories, then we can come back to the discussions. Maybe that's that way we can get the entire picture of what he has in mind.
Sounds good, Bala. And by the way,
Yeah.
please do keep your inputs coming. I'm taking side notes as I speak, and I will go add those details or make the updates to this document later this week. So don't intend to, I absolutely do value the inputs. But in the interest of time, user story 2 is building upon first user story, but this showcases upgrade scenario. So we are trying to upgrade user plane capacity, and there are two sub stories that are tied to that. There is first, which is just upgrading the resources for one of the UPFs, and the second one is a traffic scaling scenario where we need to deploy a new edge cluster and a UPF to be able to carry additional, let's say, traffic. And the proposed design essentially builds similar to the first user story. You can see a new UPF being instantiated. One of the key difference here is this almost solves for somewhat day 2 scenario as well, where you can see traffic going up and you want to be able to make some design changes and back into your operational structure. Out of scope, in addition to user story 1, automation of the new workload cluster 3. Sana, to your point, automating all the CNI plugins on for the edge cluster is out of scope. But again, we'll need to be a little bit more selective on what all we can accomplish through Nephio as part of V1.
That sounds good, Kaushik. As long as we have a way for us to eventually gather more CNI plugins automation in the future.
Exactly. And of course, it's up to us to ensure the design is extensible to help solve for that in a subsequent release. So that's just the part of how to build an extensible design. Okay, user story 3 is similar to story 1, but it's trying to upgrade a control plane element. In this case, it's SMF. So we are trying to upgrade CPU and memory. There was a comment by Eric about, hey, but the more realistic use case is we need to upgrade number of sessions served by a SMF instance, the number of PDU sessions in this case. What would be the set of corresponding user stories that that result in solving for that real world problem? That's something, Eric. I'll love to for you or anyone else here to provide that input. The simplistic one here is upgrading resources for an SMF, but maybe there are other ways, right, to solve for more realistic stories tied to scaling the number of PDU sessions for a control plane element like SMF. Those were the 3 stories that we have included as part of Nephio V1. There are a few more user stories that are listed at the bottom, but in interest of time, our position has been that we should bring those into a future scope. Let's keep the scope here relatively minimal or achievable in a, let's say, a few months worth of timeline, so that we can all focus and drive towards design and implementation tied to these user stories.
Kaushik, I have one more comment to make. A lot of people during the requirements gathering were trying to ask very fundamental questions like, how do we establish the difference from the status quo by presenting our demo to the community in the release 1? And I felt as if this is a very burning question. So even at the conceptual level, can we demonstrate some differentiators when we are able to accomplish the 3 user stories? Because I would like to show that as one of the primary things that introduces the work of Nephio to the community and starts to build that baseline, that how is it different from the status quo and what benefits it can bring. Even if it is very small, we can show the incremental benefits growing more into it with the future user stories. But that fundamental difference should be able to show with the first set of accomplishment that we do at the end of release 1. John, if you have any questions. Ravi also mentioned a similar comment in the comment section.
Yeah, I think, well, it looks like Bala has his hand ahead of me.
Okay.
Oh, thanks, John. So
my question was to Kaushik and John. I'll park and I'll let everybody else ask questions too.
Okay, thank you, Sana. So Kaushik, it's more of an understanding question. First of all, thanks for putting the user stories. So the upgrade scenarios, the resource upgrade scenarios, generally, if you want to upgrade any of these network functions, do you increase the CPU memory footprint vertically, or do you actually spin up more sessions of such that enough? What is more appropriate use case when it comes to
So actually, I'll answer both Sana's in your question, I think, at least in my view of how things should work. So with respect to Sana's question, one thing that I was thinking about, and like one of the issues I see with the status quo is that when you have a bunch of, when you have a network function, and you've got a bunch of Helm charts underneath that network function in order to provision it, what you end up doing is bubbling up all of the values in the different Kubernetes resource manifests get bubbled up into parameters into the values file. And that means that that particular network function's interface effectively is that values file. And that interface then is different for every single vendor, every single network function, every single component. So let's look at some things that are common across network functions that we need to do, that if we could make a standardized methodology for that, we could build code once that, say, integrates to some internal system. So what I always come back to, maybe because of my background, is IPAM. So if we think about an IP address allocation between, between the SMF and the UPF to talk to each other on the same subnet, then we need, as we configure the SMF, we need to give it those IP addresses. As we configure each UPF, we need to give them those IP addresses, and we need to put those into the bespoke values file configuration in the status quo, which means we need to allocate them sort of upfront a priori at the very beginning and inject them. And every vendor's package, certainly, and every network function probably from that vendor has a different place and set of places where you have to put those. So what I'm hoping to get out of V1 and build enough infrastructure to do is something a little bit different, where instead the package that represents the individual network function, it knows about the CRD that represents that network function, of course, knows about that it needs an IP address in this particular interface. And we actually can defer that allocation one step of the way. So we're splitting out, and I'm getting long-winded here, sorry about that. The point is we're splitting out sort of the metadata needed to make that IP address allocation and doing it a little bit later in the process with an automated controller. And that same little bit of metadata can live in any network functions package associated just with an interface. And that same controller then can pick up that little bit of metadata and make the appropriate allocation and inject it into the config at that point. So we no longer have to have the controller that understands that at the very beginning, understand how to do IPAM in my organization, which might be completely my own private system that I've built, as well as understand the specific values file structure for every single network function. Instead, we just simply have to, we can build one controller from our organization that can populate the IP addresses based on that metadata that flows through the system. So that's one, I think, example of a change to the status quo and that I see as possible. Bala, with respect to vertical versus horizontal. So this is actually another really interesting place where I also see us doing something different from the status quo. So in the status quo, like if you think about a Helm chart, you inject in the beginning, we have this many replicas, we have this CPU usage, we have this memory requests and limits, and those are sort of populated. Those are again bubbled up all the way to the surface. What I would want to do instead is when we measure UPF capacity, we would do that sort of externally in terms of what the architect needs. So I want this uplink bandwidth, this downlink bandwidth, and I want maybe this number of PDU sessions to be able to be handled by this UPF. Now, I put that into a common resource, and that common resource is then processed by a function. This is where I get into my kept stuff. A function that understands the structure of that particular package and can take that input and reconfigure the package according to that. So I did exactly this in my early POC, where I said with core DNS, which isn't a sophisticated network function, but it's something. The horizontal versus vertical scaling question is really important because it'll saturate a NIC with one CPU. So it's meaningless to vertically scale it and give it more CPU. So so what I did is I said, I want this level of, or I could have said, I want this level of QPS. And then a function inside says, oh, that level of QPS, I need to bump the number of replicas. I need to bump the CPU this much, but no more than that. So from the higher level orchestrator point of view, it's just asking for QPS. But internally, the package has some ability to understand what that means in terms of this particular package, because for core DNS, it might be one way, for named it might be a different way. So that's my take on both of those questions.
John, I think it's a very good idea if we can actually create a document in which we capture a lot of the differences that you mentioned and what's yet to prove, and show this is the status quo and this is what we can accomplish with Nephio, and we should have it ready before the one summit, because a lot of people will be asking these questions, and I think we should have it handy. And I understand what you said. Bala, if that answered your question as well or not.
Yes, thank you, John and Sana. Yeah,
perfect.
And Kaushik as well, he also answered it in the chat.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's I know we have talked about this in the past, but to me, one of the unique differentiator is to be able to have a unified automation framework that uses KRM, which is the original Kubernetes way of managing resources. Apply that same construct to all the three layers that are applicable in a real world network deployment, which is infrastructure, the network function deployment, and the network function configuration. And I think that in itself is pretty fundamental and unique that I do not believe anyone else has yet tried to solve in the way that we are trying to push for Nephio. So
absolutely,
whatever form factors that we all are describing in terms of product scope, user stories, I would let's keep that in mind as the baseline, and then other areas that John talked about, like those are the more finer grained differentiators that we can now start to realize through the specifics of these stories.
Right, Kaushik. And Kaushik, I think when we do put together that conceptual document, we can say we targeted some in the release 1 to demonstrate, and the future ones will actually demonstrate more. But I think we are 100% aligned on the way our business and investment is getting wasted by the heterogeneity of our deployment models across different types of network functions and how we are managing them at scale. I think it's presenting a very big operational overhead in the industry at the moment. So everybody can speak to that. Different types of EMSs, different types of configuration deployment models, out-of-band deployments of the infrastructure and the network functions, and very little ability to actually provide the dynamic parameters to your automation pipelines, the way John mentioned at the beginning. I think these are very big wins, fundamentally. And if we can start to show that in the comparison document, I think a lot of the community clarity will come out of that effort. John, there was once a time when you described the shift left approach as well, which was, I think, very powerful to understand. To everyone who knows how the existing value files in the Helm charts work and what is the struggle associated with that when you're doing it at scale, I think people can appreciate that analogy very well as well.
Okay, good. Thank you. We can try to capture this all somewhere.
Yes.
And how are we gonna work on all this comments? Because I can see very valuable feedback is coming on this. I know it's more of management question here, but I mean, taking this entire stuff into one use story may not be possible in the first release, right? And all this comments cannot be overruled also. So, are we planning to actually have some backlog sort of thing, or again create this into multiple tasks?
That's a great question. Like, one of the things we need to deal with, and it's kind of the next meeting, the SIG release, is I've been thinking about this too, is how we're going to manage all of these. Like, we need a project board or something in GitHub where we start to build a backlog, because it's going to be overwhelming quickly.
And one more thing is we should also create some sort of grouping across this, because some of them will be related, and we need to actually have them in a specific group so that we can actually take them on priority, right? That's also something we can plan out. Right.
I think it's you, Kaushik.
Yeah, so tactically, while we figure out the right logistics, what I'll do is I've jotted down offline what the response or inputs from the community in today's call has been. I will try my best to go update the document in line with those comments and circulate maybe by end of this week. Let me do that, but by and large, I just wanted to maybe level set with the community here, right? These user stories, like I described originally, they are deriving from the requirements feedback that we've received from many of you, and are falling out from the design principles that we had established in the past, right? Are there any fundamental concerns with the scope or the goals of this product stories, or is it more about, hey, let's try to refine it to better clarify who the consumers of each of these user stories are? Is it day one versus day two? Like, I see some of those things are still probably in differentiators of what we want to, the outcome of Nephio we want to showcase and so forth. Like, I'll go update the document based on this, but beyond that, are there any fundamental disagreements around the scope and the way we are positing these stories? Go ahead, Vim.
So I think, so basically, the reason for my day two is an overloaded term. So I just wanted to clarify why I made the comment. So I think what you have in mind is basically changing like the CPU or the amount of sessions that a certain network function can handle, right? Which is, in my view, from what needs to happen within the scope, different from, let's say, adding a DNN or an APN or adding a tracking area and stuff like that. The things that are involved to make that happen are potentially different. So as such, that's why I was trying to differentiate, or in my comment when I said day two, I was trying to make it relate to that more or less. So I believe that the changes, so in your user stories, you want to actually do changes on a network function that have been instantiated. And I think the differentiation will be about what that is that we are talking about. If it's just about CPU and memory or amount of sessions, I think it will be different compared to certain other configuration aspects of a network function.
Understood. That's fair, Vim. I will go update the terminology to clearly outline one. By the way, I'm happy to take some day two scenarios, but I would prefer that we don't complicate the functional dependencies between network functions, because the moment we bring in, let's say, a new APN or a new tag and so forth, now that establishing that across the full suite of network functions and so forth can get fairly complex, and my default is to posit that beyond V1. But yes, maybe that's probably a verbiage change based on the way, Vim, you're describing.
Yeah. So that's why I wanted to differentiate day two. There is different aspects of day two, but yeah. I think more or less, I think we are on the same page. I think what you've done is great, right? So I think it clarifies a lot. All my comments that I made, by the way, are a bit nitpicking. So it's just a bit of, yeah, maybe I can suggest a way to frame it a bit better, but it's nitpicking at the moment. Thanks.
So if I may follow up from my side, for the user stories, I would love to have headlines which sort of highlight the basic principles which we would like to demonstrate with the help of these use cases. Currently, if I'm only sort of presenting, yes, we can deploy a 5GC, it's not that convincing internally to sell that as a sort of a benefit from the Nephio project. So what John has been mentioning regarding sort of the considerations regarding a well-defined configuration management, a consistent information model which takes care of dependencies. These things I would like to have sort of as a sort of a introduction to, and that's sort of why we're going to make use of this special setup, because it's going to demonstrate those principles sort of in a manner which can then show how Nephio works. And this is what I'm missing currently from the user stories. This is not crisp enough for sharing internally, at least.
That's a fair point, Bernard, right? And it's mentioned in the product goals about, consistent information models, maybe not the same language, but we need to make sure the user stories are establishing those product goals. I think that linkage is not clear, and that's a clear feedback that I heard from many of you.
That means per user story, we need to highlight that. That means this user story is going to demonstrate, and then based on that, sort of, we can show sort of how that works.
Understood. I'll take that AI, Bernard. I do internally have a good sense of what I think will be the clear product goals and the differentiators, but yes, we need to put that in wording for each story.
Cool. Thanks. I think, Kaushik, from the functional requirements perspective, I think looking at the timelines, I think we have a good collection here. There's one thing, non-functional requirement. I was thinking about how the users are going to consume this. So are we writing any docs or deployment model scripts in the capacity of an installer? A simple one. So I think from the user consumption perspective, just to play around the V1, I think that's needed. So I don't know whether you want to capture that as a separate user story, or you thought it's going to be implicit.
That's a good point. And in fact, there was a comment, at least two people had also talked about this. The user stories need to clearly outline who the user is and how is it that that product scope is going to be consumed. So I will take that AI and update it. It's hopefully not too different from the scope of the user stories, but yes, it is. I will go update it in the document and share it with the group.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Kaushik.
I had a similar comment, and it was like I was more thinking from how does an operator relate these user stories with their own deployment scenarios, because it's a 5G core, but at the end of the day, 5G core is servicing a particular RAN segment or a bunch of RAN instances, and deployment will be different for, say, a private or kind of a dense urban or rural and so on. So I think somewhere we have to state clearly the assumptions on the RAN and the kind of deployment this particular use case stories could be kind of visualized under, right? So it's just kind of elaborating on the earlier point. The user should be clearly kind of spelled out both from a deployment perspective as well as, I would say, even from the RAN perspective.
Yeah, Ravi, we can capture that. By and large, these are relatively standard interfaces based on the user story one that we described. So there should not be a lot of requirements on RAN and UE, but as long as they conform to those specs. But yes, we'll clearly call that out in each of the user stories. I think the key thing is outline how the consumption of the user story is going to happen across the board. That is not clear from the wording here.
I was also talking basically, with Open RAN and core, everything is going to hierarchical cloud model, right? So and everything is going to be in private and in a private 5G. Everything is localized. In other case, things are spread around. So that view has to be clear. I mean, so even though we do it just for the core, but what is the basic assumption on this distributed cloud infrastructure and deployment and so on, so that they can relate it to it. People who understand, okay, this is where probably they can relate it to, because the deployment is kind of more or less in that mature or in the production phase.
Okay, Bala, maybe, sorry, Ravi, can I sync with you offline a little bit? Like, I hear you, but I want to make sure I fully understand, like, the way, there are many ways to, like, I don't want to go too expansive and trying to address every possible deployment scenario and give guidelines and so forth. This is a relatively more scoped work around Nephio even. I'll need to sync with you to understand, like, if you have examples of what kind of things that we can propose as guidelines about open LAN and so forth, like, it will help ground my thinking. So why don't we connect offline to follow through?
Sure, yeah. Yeah. I'll give you what I understand and with my exposure in the RAN space and so on. Yeah.
Maybe just Ravi, shoot me an email with some examples, and I'm happy to follow offline with you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm just scoping in terms of what the typical 5G deployments are in terms of where the RAN instances kind of reside versus where the core resides, and once it's spread out for macro and in the regional versus in the central cloud. And of course, it again depends on the service type. We are doing EMBB, RLC, and all that. So it is looking from all this perspective. Okay? I'm just trying to, when people see this, these are all the factors that come into their mind. Hey, what is the context this particular user story might apply? I mean, I'm assuming that operators would have a view in this, but these are the natural questions that would come into a person's mind.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, Kaushik, one basic question. Again, I'm late to the party here, sorry, but with my experience in orchestration level, are we thinking about any federation also here? Because we are talking about infra level of orchestration, right? I mean, you're actually showing here, we also require to actually have a cluster with orchestration. I think we spoke about it, or you were actually answering one of the questions when I just joined in. But we also require to actually think about multi-level orchestration also here, right? So do we have anything in plan? Maybe not in the current user story scope, but maybe in something in future. If we don't have the provision of it, we don't have the provision of it, it will become too complex later on to manage it. That's my concern, actually.
Yes, so we have talked. The reason I have not included it in Nephio V1 was, like I described, my proposal is to scope and ground the implementation appropriately. This is something, Sai, what you brought up has been described. I have not listed it explicitly as a user story in this document. I'm happy to keep a repository of future user stories of interest, and then we can sort out how to roadmap that beyond V1. That's an exercise we should regardless do, but it's not something that I have done until yet.
Okay, because my only concern is it should not become too rigid if you don't consider it, right, Kaushik? It will become too rigid later on. And having handled multiple orchestration scenarios, I know how it works. That once I mean, as you know, software engineers, we build something, and if it's working, we don't want to touch it. So I don't want to get in that scenario also. Perhaps we should have some placeholder also when we're thinking about it. That's, again, I'm trying to give my 2 cents here to ensure that we don't miss that point, actually, Kaushik. Yeah.
Absolutely. Point well taken, Sai.
Sure. Thanks.
Hey everyone, we are 2 minutes past. Of course, keep your inputs and suggestions coming, but maybe just either unicast them to me offline or tag it in this document. Like I said, I've taken a few AIs from this community meeting as well as the updates on the comments on this document. I will go curate the document in line with these comments. Hopefully by Thursday or so, I should have an updated document recirculated with the community. But if you have more inputs, please do circle back and add those in the next 24 to 48 hours, so I can help address, or we can all collectively help improve the scope of Nephio V1 in line with the inputs.
Kaushik, is it possible to get offline with you? I mean, is it possible to have a discussion of this? Sure. Looking forward
Yes,
for that.
yes, please. Just so that logistically, I'm in India. I guess most of
Great.
you are on the other side.
I'm in Bangalore. Don't worry. I'm
You're
in
in
Bangalore.
Bangalore too, so
Yeah,
that we can work
This is Seshu, by the
easily.
way. This is Seshu from Wind River. So I'll try to ping you separately, Kaushik.
Perfect.
Perfect. Thank you. Are you from Bangalore too, Kaushik, by the way?
Okay,
Yes.
we're past time. We have another call for SIG release, so I'm going to stop recording and head out.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Great
you.
call.